Okay, here you want to come to example 5. And this one we're going to take a closer look at the Voronoi fraction node and how to use it and the parameters that are important, and a little bit how to get more nicer looking breakup of our objects. So let's start with this box here. Let's make it a polygon mesh, axis division 444. As you remember, we need to cut some points into this. So we're going to make it a volume with ISO offset. A new thing here is we're going to use a volume VOP to add some noise into this volume. How you do this is very simple. Volume VOP works on the density field usually. So you pipe the density field into multiply, you pipe the position into turbulence noise. The turbulence noise goes out into the input to the multiply, and the multiply goes back into the density output. In the turbulent noise, we're just going to put it to sparse convolution noise, and that's it. You just get a little bit more interesting distribution of the points, since the points will scatter based on the density of the volume, like this. If I switch this off, you can totally see that the points are way denser here, because this area is denser with the volume. And this, in turn, is going to give a really cool effect in the Voronoi fracture, looking like this. You won't really see it, but the first input is point piped in first input. First input is box, so the input is points. If you do an exploded view after that, we can see that this area that was densely populated with points gets way smaller pieces, and here where the points were more sparsely scattered, they get bigger. Basically because the pieces are allowed to be bigger, since the centers are further away from each other, basically. So that's a pretty cool way to break up the point distribution and the scale of each piece, just to get a bit more realistic results. Obviously, you can art direct this way more. If you know that an area needs smaller pieces, you can scatter more points in it. If you know an area needs bigger pieces, you can scatter less points in it, and so on. Anyway, let's go back to the Voronoi fracture. So in the Voronoi fracture, we have a couple of really useful things I'm going to go over. Up here, I don't really use this too much. The visualize pieces feature is really cool. You can see that each piece gets a color, which makes it easier to see. But other than that, it's not so important. You can use a group if you want to fracture a part of an object or something like this. You can group it, and then you can put the group here. I haven't done it here, but yeah. So let's keep the visualize pieces on. In the cut tab, we have an auto detect for triangulation, and this is just to see if it's 2D, 2D, 3D, or use existing. Usually you want to keep it auto detect, or almost always. So yeah, you can offset the cut plane just to create some weird gaps in between the pieces, if that's what your simulation needs. Usually I keep this as 0, not so worried about that. So the cut plane is pretty basic, not so much going on there. In the cluster tab, however, this is a really interesting thing with the Voronoi fracture node. So each piece looks really plain and boring when it's like this. It looks really computer made, right? To get some really interesting shapes into this, we can go to the cluster tab and we can enable clustering. What clustering basically will do is we'll take a couple of pieces that are close to each other and basically conjoin them into a new piece, which will distribute a very interesting pattern of pieces like this. So if we now go ahead and explode view this, we can see that these pieces are very interesting looking now. They're a little bit more detailed, a little bit more weird and interesting, which is cool. So basically, the cluster is an attribute. You can define the cluster on the points up here if you want. I'm not going to go over this now. This might be a future tutorial, but you can actually define the clustering of the points, because cluster is a string attribute that this will pick up. But for now, we're just going to do clustering on the actual Voronoi fracture, and you have a lot of things here you can work with, so that's fine. We can define the size of clusters. We can make the clusters really small, or we can make the clusters really big. Really big clusters tend to be kind of weird looking like this. Can be a nice feature, I guess, if that's something you want to do. But yeah, so this basically defines how the search area for each cluster. I'm going to keep it at 0.5 because that's a pretty good value for this kind of sized box. We can offset this to get a different noise pattern if we're not happy with how it's looking. Anyway, I'm happy with this. So it's basically just a noise offset. Yeah, obviously you can switch off the noise in the cluster, but that's going to give a really weird result like this. So you want to keep the noise on. The jitter doesn't really do much. But yeah, as we can see now though, there is some we are almost going backwards now, that all the pieces are really chunky and big, and like there's no small pieces except for these 3 down here, which is not so realistic either. So another way that we can do that in the Voronoi fracture here with the clustering is that we can enable random detachment. This means that a set percentage of the pieces will be just randomly detached into their own cluster. So we will generate some smaller pieces inside of the bigger clusters. So let's take this on and see what happens. We can immediately see that in this big green here, we have a small blue piece here. In this bigger green here, we have this little yellow guy here. In this gray here, we have these 2 coming on. In this big purple, we have this in the middle of it, and this small greenish one here. It kind of just breaks it up a little bit better and makes it look like a little bit more interesting. So let's go ahead and go to the exploded view now, and we can see that we have a good distribution now between big clustery pieces and then these small randomly detached singular pieces. And how this is defined is by the detached ratio. This is basically a percentage. So this is a percentage of all the pieces. So if 10% of the pieces are detached, it's gonna look like this. If we then bump it up to 20%, even more pieces are detached. If you bump this to a 1, all pieces are gonna be detached back to the normal state. Maybe we only want like a couple of clusters. We can put 70% of the pieces detached, and then we can have a couple of clusters like this one, this green big here. Let's find another cluster. Do we have another cluster? Yeah, I think this purple here is also a cluster, but it's a bit more random and like way less common for clusters up here. But let's keep that 0.1. Let's keep 10% detached. I think that's pretty good value for this. What else? We can define the seed. Obviously, if we're not happy with the defined detached pieces, we can just put a different seed, and different pieces are detached. We can keep on scrolling here until we find something we like, but I'm gonna keep it at seed 0. Yeah. Same here. There's a cluster attribute. As you remember, there's a name attribute for each piece. The cluster attribute is the same. It gives a cluster string attribute. So all the pieces that are in the same cluster gets the same cluster string attribute. And how we can see this is by actually defining this. If I go ahead and delete this, and I delete non-selected, we can see that we have deleted a cluster here, same color. Let's go to the geometry spreadsheet, and we can see that in here we have a name attribute for all the pieces that are 22. So the pieces are 22. If we go ahead and disable the cluster and go here, we can clearly see that these are in different pieces now. It kind of rabbles it up a little bit, so it's fine, but yeah. So if we want to find the cluster attribute, I'm trying to figure out where is the cluster attribute. Anyway, regardless, it creates an attribute called cluster. Ah, no, actually, you know what? It does. It doesn't. This is the cluster attribute it takes in. So it's gonna look for an attribute called cluster on these points, but it can't find anything because we don't have a cluster attribute here. If you instead put an attribute create here, we create the cluster, and we put it to a string, and we call it cluster 1. All the pieces have the same cluster attribute now, which means that they should... It doesn't work, huh? It needs to be a primitive, I think. Let's see. We'll go over this in a future tutorial. I'm not too sure what's going wrong here, but anyway. Regardless, once they're clustered, they do receive the same piece attribute. So, I don't know why my geometry spreadsheet doesn't work now, but whatever. Regardless, they do receive the same piece attribute, so this is piece 22 now, instead of being multiple pieces. That's all I wanted to say. And yeah, so that's a cluster tab. It's a lot of things you can do in here, so definitely take a look at that and be educated about it. Like go through it and try the parameters and see what happens. Regardless, that's the cluster tab. Let's go to interior detail tab. The interior detail tab is there for making, as it sounds, the interior detail more detailed and noisy and kind of like something just fractured and broke apart. Because if we do explode view on this, we can see that it started to get some shape to it, right? The pieces start to get shaped, but there is no detail inside. It's just plain faces like that. The Voronoi node gives us a semi-good way to do this. There's a couple of other ways to do it by your own, which is going to be better in the long run, but we're going to go with the Voronoi node, so I'm going to go with this. You can now add interior detail to these pieces by clicking this. It is going to slow down your simulation, because it's going to be more geometry, right? But it basically will look like this. Let's switch off the visualize noise. And it's gonna look like this. As you can see, we now have a lot more detail, at least I would say, on the inside, and the faces on the outside are still smooth, which means that if we have no exploded view, it's gonna look like the original box altogether. So there's a couple of parameters we can define this by as well. In here, we can define the detail size, which basically means that if we go here, we can see that if you zoom in on this is interior detail. If you go to detail size, we can put it to 1, which means that the detail will be way bigger, which means less detail. You can scroll it up, obviously, until we almost breaking the inside pieces. But if you go down to a pretty low value, like 0.05, we start to see that there's a more detailed interior. Let's go back to the original. Something like this, and the noise is now very apparent. We can also define the noise amplitude. It's a bit noisy, so let's down the amplitude to 0.1. That looks really cool. We can define the noise and the frequency and the offset and turbulence and all these kind of things. Yeah, these are not too important, to be honest. You can do a lot of like ramping and like define if you want less noise closer to the edges and stuff like this. But that's a bit overcourse, so I'm going to do it in a tutorial. But this is basically how you get some more detail on the interiors. But do keep in mind that this will slow down your simulation. This will slow down significantly. You can also visualize the noise scale by clicking this. You can see that the noise scale closer to the edges is less. If it's red, that's where the noise are most apparent. Then it kind of fades out towards the edges. And then purple is 0, basically. So yeah, that's how interior detail works. Let's go to groups. Groups will basically just create groups for you, which means that it will group the outside faces and the inside faces. This means that we can basically put a blast after this, and we can find that there's an inside and outside group here. If you do the inside group, we're basically blasting all the faces on the inside, and on the opposite, if you blast the outside group, we only get the faces on the inside. This can be useful for some things if you want to scatter particles on the inside of a breaking surface, or if you want to do something like that, or if you want to manipulate the geometry further, you can do that. It's just a handy way to create groups for these two outer and interior surface, and they are defined here. Interior group is called inside, exterior group is called outside. Yeah. So the attributes is just the attributes outputted. As we remember, we have a name prefix or a name attribute called piece. And the pieces go from 0 to however many pieces you have. So in this case, we have, let's see, how many pieces do we have? We have 81 pieces. So the piece attribute would go from, oh yeah, it doesn't work. Let's add a new one. It goes from, let's check, primitive, let's hide all attributes. Let's go to the name. So they go from 0 to, let's order them. Let's go from 0 to, yeah, it's not in order for some reason. I don't know. Anyway, they should go from 0 to 81 or 0 to 82. 0 to 80, sorry. So piece 0 and piece 80 are the minimum and maximum pieces. You can also keep interior attributes like piece, cell point, clip point, outside depth. You can create cell point attributes. It's a bit overkill, so I'm not going to go over it now either. But yeah, this is basically the most important part of the Voronoi fracture node. Now let's do a simulation of this. Let's move it up a little bit. Let's pack it based on the name, which means we're going to get 81 packed fragments. Let's not add any velocity, or yeah, let's add velocity and angular velocity actually. Let's do output, and in the DOPNet it's similarly as before, just simple as this. Yeah, and let's have a look at how this looks when it's simulated. So it's gonna be a little bit slower, but it's gonna have more detail basically. As you can see, we have a good distribution between big and small pieces, and they look way more interesting than before. Let's switch this off and let's play it again. Now it's simply gonna fall down and break apart on the ground like that. So that's pretty cool. It looks way more like rocks now, which is awesome. Yeah. So this is basically the basics of the parameters on the Voronoi fracture node. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you guys in the next tutorial. Thank you for watching, and bye.